Well, what a topic we're exploring over the next 2 days. I mean, you think religion and you're dealing with a fascinating set of questions. You think the presidency and you're dealing with another fascinating set of questions, especially combustible questions, as we saw in election 2004. Now, combine these two combustible elements on their own, religion and the presidency, and you get potentially explosive discourse in our nation because they go right to our core values. They go to those bedrock questions that any community asks itself. How shall we live together? What is the relationship? What are the boundaries between private belief and public behavior? How shall we reconcile competing claims to the good life or competing claims for what is good? Well, over the next 2 days, we're going to put ourselves right in the middle of this explosive combination, religion and the presidency, and look at it from different perspectives. We're going to look historically and see what impact religion has had on our presidents' lives and how their core beliefs have shaped the policies they've championed. We're going to look politically and see how presidents have used religion to build inner strength, to be sure, but also to build alliances, to gain partisan advantage, and to contribute to faction. We're going to look culturally to learn more about the habits of the American heart and what we expect of a president who on occasion seems more like an elected monarch, or I would argue even a high priest, than a chief executive. And we're even going to look linguistically to learn more about the code words, the fighting words, the pungent words that we use to shape our national discourse on our most controversial topics. But throughout, I am confident, given the scholars assembled, that we can look at religion and the presidency constructively and learn much from each other.
I'd like to welcome you to the Early Presidents panel. We're going to be hearing about a Mason, a man who read his Bible and another who edited his own, and a Princeton graduate, an explosive combination if there ever was one. Not referring to our panelists, of course, but to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Abraham Lincoln.
Even before he died in 1799, a battle began over the nature and significance of George Washington's faith. Well, more heated at some times than others, this conflict has now been waged for more than 200 years. Among American presidents, only the religious convictions and practices of Abraham Lincoln have been as closely scrutinized as those of Washington. Of all the varied aspects of the Virginian's life, few have caused as much contention as his religious beliefs and habits. Moreover, no chief executive has had his religious life so distorted by folklore. Many of the hundreds of books, articles, sermons, and essays published about his faith and practices since 1800 have advanced ideological agendas rather than providing dispassionate analysis. On the one side are ministers and primarily Protestant evangelical authors who claim that Washington had a deep, rich, Orthodox Christian faith. On the other side are free thinkers and numerous contemporary scholars who argue that Washington was a deist or a Unitarian whose faith was not very meaningful to him. Given Washington's immense contributions to the American Republic, semi-divine status, and importance to American civil religion, this intense debate is not surprising. I will summarize this debate over Washington's faith and take a middle position that portrays the first president as a theistic rationalist who believed strongly that God ruled and directed the universe. Although he apparently did not accept several key Orthodox Christian doctrines, Washington's belief in God's providence powerfully impacted his work as both commander-in-chief and president. To a certain extent during his life, and even more after his death, Washington was elevated to sainthood. An American civil religion arose that revered the great founder as God's instrument and a larger-than-life mythological hero. In life and in death, the Virginian has been seen as the deliverer of America, the savior of his people, the American Moses, and even a demigod.
Jefferson read his Constitution more strictly. It gave him only civil powers, as he said, and he had, quote, no authority to direct the religious exercises of his constituents. Yet Jefferson did not erase religion from public discourse. While hoping as president to strengthen religious freedom, as he wrote, he asserted that he did not desire a, quote, government without religion. That charge, he told an ally, was a lie fostered by his enemies. And in his second inaugural, he returned again to biblical imagery to describe the nation's relationship with God. It's a stunning statement of civil religion. I shall need, too, he said, the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our fathers as Israel of old from their native land, who has covered our infancy with his providence and our riper years with his wisdom and power, and to whose goodness I ask you to join in supplication with me. He recognized the nation's dependence on God and invited his fellow citizens to prayer. He did not command it. He also gave them an example, rhetoric in action. As James Hudson has pointed out, the Sunday after he wrote that letter to the Danbury Baptists, Jefferson began attending church services in the hall of the House of Representatives, and that became his regular practice for the rest of his time in office whenever he was in Washington. Nor did his wall of separation mean hostility to the churches or prevent his administration from openly fostering Christianity among the Native Americans. Those who look for historic support for the faith-based initiative can, for better or worse, look back to Jefferson's record. He openly supported what had been the policy of his Federalist predecessors, Washington and Adams, in helping to fund Catholic and Protestant missionaries in their efforts to convert and thereby civilize the Native American population. Jefferson himself endorsed a treaty with the Kaskaskia tribe that provided federal funds to build a church and support a Catholic priest. With his approval, the government encouraged a Presbyterian minister's work among the Cherokees by appropriating several $100s to found what was designed to be a Christian school to teach religion along with other subjects. And Jefferson ordered that $6,000 be appropriated by his government to a Quaker mission among the Indians in the Old Northwest. Religion was, after all, a civilizing force. It would prove useful, he thought, in calming the frontier and in persuading the Indians to give up much of their lands, a major objective of his Native American policy. Throughout his administration as president, Thomas Jefferson found religion helpful to his politics and his policies. Religious freedom, not separation, was Jefferson's absolute.
I cannot make the following point forcefully enough. The wall of separation interpretation simply misinterprets Madison's thought. Madison's policy was that the state could neither privilege nor punish religion. Madison would not have allowed the government to exclude religious organizations from generally available governmental programs on account of their religious character. To some extent, this strict separationist misinterpretation is understandable. More forcefully than any other founder, Madison broke from the classical Republican teaching. Traditionalists like George Washington had argued that Republican government requires a virtuous citizenry, and that the cultivation of virtue requires religion. Their argument, Washington's argument, thus concluded that in order to nurture the qualities of good citizenship, government ought to endorse, encourage, and even directly support religion. Madison rejected this classical Republican teaching. He did not deny the importance of virtue. He did not deny that religion helped to cultivate virtue. But Madison vehemently denied that religion needed the support of government. To say that religion requires governmental support, he wrote in Article 6 of the Memorial and Remonstrance, and I'm quoting, is a contradiction to the Christian religion itself, for every page of it disavows a dependence on the powers of this world. It is a contradiction to fact, for it is known that religion both existed and flourished, not only without the support of human laws, but in spite of every opposition from them. If one bedrock principle guided Madison's position, it was his commitment to individual liberty in matters of religious faith. His individualism is clearly reflected in the theology assumed by the Memorial and Remonstrance. Responsibilities to our Maker belong to the individual alone and must be fulfilled with a clear conviction and conscience. Madison recognized and sought to defend, accordingly, the individual's right to the free exercise of religion. This right, he believed, prevented the state from adopting policies that unfavorably targeted or disfavored religion as such. Madison would not agree with today's strict separationists or those who champion the wall of separation interpretation of the Establishment Clause. But Madison would also disagree with those today who call for an official religious presence in American public life. Madison sought, not always successfully, to privatize religion. He acknowledged that religion can play an important role in public life. He acknowledged that religion can support personal virtue. But unlike George Washington, Madison did not believe that the government ought to support religion as such. Religion, he argued, ought to receive no special privileges or consideration. Madison's constitutional policy was very simple. No privileges because you're religious, but no penalties because you're religious. His fundamental prudential assumption, which was not shared by more classical Republicans, was that religion did not need governmental support and that such support inevitably proved to be detrimental to religion and religious freedom. Now, whether Madison was right on matters of church and state is ultimately for us to decide. But whatever verdict we render, our deliberations will surely be profited by our attention to Madison's thought and his practice regarding religion and the role of it in American public life.
But today I'm going to focus on the greatest example of Lincoln's religious politics, which was his second inaugural address. Beginning his second term as president, Lincoln delivers a 4-paragraph reflection on American theodicy, the problem of evil, specifically slavery, in God's providence. Where the original draft of the Gettysburg Address contains no direct reference to God, the second inaugural address places God's purposes in the Civil War front and center. Lincoln interprets how the war had progressed under both human and divine intention and action, and where the Almighty may yet direct its consummation. Significantly, the address shows the extent to which Lincoln sees the reason and religion of men fall short in averting a civil war. In a telling demonstration of Republican statesmanship, under the providence of God, Lincoln ironically uses both reason and religion to deliver the lesson. Foremost in his mind was uniting a divided nation. Only a common understanding of the war could ensure a lasting peace. Lincoln showed how both the war and emancipation came to the country despite the initial intentions of either side in the conflict. Another power must be at work, and Lincoln returned the country to that other higher power in hopes that a common national humility before the Almighty would help Americans both North and South to fix what they had broken. Following his second inaugural, Lincoln wrote of his address, "I expect the latter to wear as well as, perhaps better than, anything I have produced, but I believe it is not immediately popular. Men are not flattered by being shown that there has been a difference of purpose between the Almighty and them. To deny it, however, in this case, is to deny that there is a God governing the world. It is a truth which I thought needed to be told, and as whatever of humiliation there is in it falls most directly on myself, I thought others might afford for me to tell it." Through reason and religion, Lincoln shows how reason and religion failed to avert the American Civil War in order to induce the humility that will be needed for the work ahead. What failed to prevent war among Americans must now succeed in order to unite them. For me, to examine Abraham Lincoln's view of religion's role in Republican politics is to learn about American self-government. Understanding the relevance of religion, and especially Christianity, to Lincoln's politics helps us better understand his defense of the American Constitutional Union as an expression of his faith in God's purposes for himself and his country.
In 1948, more than 4 years before becoming President of the United States, Eisenhower stated, quote, "I am the most intensely religious man I know." I'm the most intensely religious man I know. Now, this extraordinary statement did not come from a zealous teenage catechumen, but was made by a mature 58-year-old adult who was then president of Columbia University. He was not naive about religious sentiment, nor unacquainted with intensely religious believers. As a hero of World War II, he had met international religious leaders. He knew of the religious faith of subordinates, such as his friend George Patton. He testified to the deep religious faith of his parents, especially his mother. He was the grandson of River Brethren ministers who had led his flock from Pennsylvania to Kansas in the 19th century. And in Abilene, Eisenhower grew up in the house of his uncle, another River Brethren minister and itinerant missionary. In other words, Eisenhower was well acquainted with religious fervor. Yet he still characterized himself as the most intensely religious man that he knew. Eisenhower's breathtaking religious self-assessment does not play large in traditional Eisenhower biography. Every biographer acknowledges the importance of religion in Eisenhower's upbringing, but after Eisenhower left home for West Point, religion disappears as a major theme in his biography, and no one emphasizes the influence of Eisenhower's deeply ingrained religious beliefs on his public life and work. Yet, if Eisenhower authentically perceived himself as a profoundly religious person, one would expect to encounter his religious values shaping the Eisenhower administration's domestic and foreign policy. And it did, except that Midwestern habits of privacy and an intensely held conviction that religion was a personal matter often masked Eisenhower's most deeply held sentiments. Nonetheless, the outward signs of his religious faith were often dramatically evident. Eisenhower is the only American president to write his own inaugural prayer, for example. He's the only president to have been baptized in the White House. He was the first president to appoint a special assistant for religion, Pastor Frederick Fox. He faithfully presided over White House prayer breakfasts. He approved adding "In God We Trust" to the United States currency, and "One Nation Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. And it was the president, not his speechwriters, it was the president who most frequently inserted religious references and themes into his public speeches.
Carter also sponsored the White House Conference on the Family, which morphed into a conference on families, as all sorts of different agencies got involved in that. And that seemed to pull him away from his religious constituency. It played into a secularist agenda and led the Republicans to say family values. So what about that? What is the presidency then for a Carter? He gets trapped, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think, yeah, good, thank you, and good question. He was trapped in a sense. He developed agendas, or an agenda, it seems to me, that he felt was addressing issues of social justice. And he also, on your second point, did emphasize in the campaign the importance of family. And actually, he had looked at what's called a family impact statement. So he wanted to see how every issue would impact the family. And the outgrowth of this, as you said, was this conference on the family, which resulted in many ways we had some folks walking out of that. A conservative group that felt it was not offered a fair chance at the table simply got up and left because the definition of family was under fire. So it seemed to me on these issues, Carter wanted to do things to uphold the family, for example, to uphold social justice, but to do so in a way that was fairly inclusive and not be exclusive at all. And so something like the Conference on the Family, I think, got him in trouble in that sense, in trying to be perhaps too many things to too many people. And yeah, I think the Malaise speech as well, in that sense, he was, I think, trying to be a president, but he was asking for the American public for their best as well as his best. There's this incident when Carter was interviewing for the nuclear submarine program, and Rickover, who was his superior, asked him, have you always done your best? And Carter said, well, yeah, I finished 59th out of 820 in the academy, Annapolis, Naval Academy. So yeah, I did pretty well. But did you always do your best? And Carter, at that point said, no, I haven't. And that stuck with him. And so that to me comes back to his Malaise speech, where he was trying to exhort the people as a prophet, in a sense, to say, well, I'm trying to do my best, and I simply want you to do your best. And so he tried to do his best. He tried to exhort people to do their best, but he, I think, always necessarily wasn't sensitive to some of the political implications of those decisions.
Clinton found it easier to mix religion and politics than his successor, George W. Bush. I think one reason was, as a Democrat perhaps, he was less suspect of trying to impose a theocracy on the American people. But I also think Clinton came about this naturally. His Baptist roots meant he knew the language, and he was able to seamlessly weave or interweave his faith and his politics. Religion affected Clinton's policies, particularly in two areas. First of all, a concern for religious freedom. Clinton signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and he became a champion of free religious expression in the public schools. But it was civil rights which energized Clinton. Speaking at the Mason Temple Church of God in Christ, he decried the decline in the black family and called for responsible behavior. According to Clinton, the message was a hymn of praise to a public philosophy rooted in my personal religious values. It came from his heart. During the second Clinton administration, the president became something of a globetrotter, and a globe-trotting pastor he was, bringing his religious values to the far corners of the world. Northern Ireland, for example, where Catholics and Protestants had been struggling with each other for years, Clinton quoted from the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the peacemakers." In Israel, Clinton, following Jewish tradition, placed a stone on the grave of Yitzhak Rabin. In South Africa, over the objections of the local priest, he attended Mass in violation of Catholic Church order, but he was unapologetic about that. And in China, he attended one of the few Protestant churches that the Chinese government permitted to exist. But Clinton's second administration, as we all know, is probably best known for allegations of marital infidelity, related cover-up, and the like. And Clinton's response was at least twofold. First of all, Clinton invited a group of spiritual counselors to meet with him regularly in the White House, and indeed they did. Afterwards, many of them said they saw a changed and chastened president, although the feeling wasn't unanimous among them. In addition, Clinton addressed the nation in a national prayer breakfast speech, ironically, on 9/11, 1998, in which he confessed his sins, and he apologized to various affected individuals. Responses to Clinton's speech were mixed. Reverend James Forbes of Riverside Church called it a real holy moment. But columnist Cal Thomas muttered that, quote, "Religion is the last refuge of a scoundrel." In my opinion, Clinton never could nor ever wished to completely jettison his religious heritage. Indeed, one could argue that Clinton's public religiosity was so convincing precisely because it was rooted in a personal spiritual core. Clinton once said that he appreciated Christianity's, quote, "idea of continuously coming back," unquote. And once, when he was asked if he believed in an afterlife, he responded, quote, "Yeah, I have to. I need a second chance." Well, he may need a few more than that, but then in that he's probably not alone.
President Bush came into the Oval Office with a history of promoting faith-based initiatives. He had done so as the governor of Texas, and he had already seen their strength and had opened the doors for them to flourish in what they do. He recognized that people of faith are able to go deep enough to accomplish transforming change in the hearts of people. He had seen the spark that had reignited powers of renewal in blighted communities in his own state of Texas. He has used the bully pulpit, I think, in a very effective way to say faith does have a rightful place in the public square. But we need to be clear about the parameters. What faith can do may not be funded by government in its fullest force. Think about this. The role of faith is to change the human heart. The government can provide the secular piece of what a faith-based group. It may not provide the faith content. You may not use government money to purchase religious materials, to involve yourself in religious instruction. They can provide the space, they can provide the legitimacy, but they cannot provide the content. George Bush knows that, but what he has done is promoted what the government can do, which is to acknowledge their legitimacy, and in some cases allow faith-based providers to compete for contracts to provide social services on the same basis as any other secular organization. And that has been accomplished largely by executive order. But the other piece of it, the private piece of it, is the piece that he has simply legitimized through the bully pulpit, and it's been very effective.
How does Bush's faith affect his foreign policy, and more specifically, the Middle East, the war on terror, the war in Iraq? And does he believe that God called on him to invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein? That's the one question that I asked everybody that I could. When I was trying to get an interview with Bush, and I was having trouble, I told Dan Bartlett, the director of communications, I said, look, can you just get me, at the very least, a response to that question? Did the president believe that God called on him to invade Iraq and remove Saddam? He said, all right, I'll try to at least get that. He gave me a typed response, okay? Quote, going into this period, the Iraq War, I was praying for the strength to do the Lord's will, but I'm surely not going to justify war based upon God. It's the same thing that he told Bob Woodward. Bush says that he prays for wisdom and strength and guidance. Now, to people who maybe don't understand religious people, they might say, all right, that wisdom thing, that guidance, all right, what about that? Well, the way this works, hopefully, is that you pray to God to do God's will, to be a messenger of God's will. But the problem is, here's the rub, you don't always know exactly where and when, if you are. And if decision X is in fact God's will. By the way, if he thought he was, he wouldn't be any different than Woodrow Wilson with the League of Nations and with George Washington in Yorktown and the American Revolution. But one of the things that George W. Bush has lamented is that his theology doesn't give him a crystal ball where he can know that for sure. So he can't know absolutely for sure. He gave a half a dozen different reasons for invading Iraq, when you stop and list them all out. None of them was because that he felt God was calling him to do it, or because he felt that Jesus one morning called on him to send in the Marines. Told the same thing to Tom Brokaw as well. All right, then how does it affect his foreign policy? This is important. George W. Bush believes that God has implanted the desire for freedom on the hearts of all human beings. All human beings. Christians, Jews, Muslims, everybody, right? And he said in Senegal, Africa, July 2003, God has imparted the desire for freedom on the heart, on the breast of all human beings. He said this many, many times.